If I lose my job tomorrow, economically, I'm fragile. Psychologically, I'm resilient.
Mm.
If I take the approaches that Joe has really pushed on us to reflect on. And so that's why it's so important. It's almost no longer a choice. If you really understand it, it's no longer a choice to do the reflection that Joe has talked to us about. It's almost a necessity. And unfortunately, we wait for disaster to occur before we start to say, "Oh, okay, I do need to start thinking about my being
Right.
right." And by that time, it's almost too late, right? You catch yourself in despair. But if you start the practice today, it makes you that much more resilient.
Welcome to the Explorations Podcast, the show about interdisciplinary discussions to unravel the secrets to a life well lived. I'm your host, Lewis, and I'm joined by my wonderful co-hosts, Edwin and Joe. Guys, how are you doing today?
Doing well.
Doing
Great to
really
see you.
well. Doing good.
We are continuing our discussion within the AI series. Last week, we entitled our discussion Human in the Loop, and we took a deep dive into the perspective of us as individuals kind of dealing with the rapid growth and change and transformation of generative AI and the impact it's had on society. If you missed that conversation, you want to listen to that episode because we are continuing that conversation with what I'm entitling The Machine in the Loop, which is a slight kind of variation of this topic of discussion. But I think in light of recent events in the global economy, in technology, and in society, I think now's a great time to kind of voice the concerns that I'm having to you guys to engage in this type of discussion. So I'm really excited to continue this conversation with you guys. So thank you for being here. And I don't know, just like since our conversation last week, Edwin, let's start with you. Have you like given any thought to our conversation? Has it changed the way that you've approached the tools, even just in the last 7 days? What are your thoughts since we've last spoke?
Yeah. Geez, have I changed? So the only reason I pause is because I actually had a great conversation with Joe about my own anxiety, right? So I came in on the previous episode sort of fully in the optimist mode, and now thinking very seriously about what does this mean, this evolution in technology, what does that mean for my own livelihood? Yeah, as a father, as a husband, as a son, it really starts to hit home the societal and a psychological impact of adoption of this technology. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about it. But for those who aren't paying attention, we're at a point now, right? This is not science fiction. This is not far off into the future. If someone is adept at using this technology, they truly have the opportunity to take 10 jobs and make it into one. And so it's only a matter of speed of adoption
Mhm.
that is really stopping us from having to deal with that particular disruption today. But it's here, folks. It's here, and I know I'm thinking more deeply about the societal impact.
Joe, last week you offered a very provocative challenge to us listeners of taking the opportunity to slow down as a way of processing and wrestling some of the changes and the rapid growth that Edwin is alluding to. Could you speak more into that as like just as someone who's kind of shared that last week? Has your perspective on AI changed just in the last 7 days? Have you given more thought to this idea of considering the human and slowing down and things of that nature?
Yeah, somewhat. So just to reiterate, I'm a big believer in tapping into a variety of potential practices that cultivate larger and more capacious spaces within our own selves so we can create the opportunity for reflection rather than reactivity. I think, when it comes to technology, and of course, with conversations like this and statements like this, we're always in danger of caricaturizing. But I think what ends up happening is that we hit the ground running. And then only after a long period of time. And usually because of some negative effects, we begin to slow down and say, okay, wait a minute, we need to reassess. Given the gravity of this new technology, I think we need to do that from the front end, as much as that's possible, we need to stay ahead of the curve. And so, I'm a huge believer in that. Was I able to do that this past week? Listen, look, I have a 9-month-old. I'm happy to have a few hours of sleep at night in his given sleep regression. But no, yeah, I'm being somewhat silly here, but yes, I have been thinking about it as I've been playing with some new LLMs, Manus. I've been messing around with that and thinking about agents. So yeah, it's been happening, and kind of I'm somewhat in that headspace.
I wanted to jump into this topic that I'm calling machine in the loop, because after our discussion last week, it feel like I experienced a paradigm shift where, as much as I was keeping up with AI news and just training up on using these tools and wondering how my life is going to be different now that these tools are taken some sort of integration in both my professional and personal life, it made me think back to just earlier conversations that we've had, like man versus machine, and just the interactions that I have with all sorts of technology. And I feel like AI is this like umbrella term for what is going to be another radical shift in technology. And what I found that happened to me personally is that it made me, it challenged my own worldview of like, how, what do I really think about human beings, like my fellow human being? Like, how do I really view the self? Like, do I really believe that humans have a soul? Because personally, when I see comparisons to things between like something made by a human and something generated by LLM, I see it compared on just the basis of work or efficiency or output. And it just, yeah, it just put me in a really introspective space, because one anxiety that I carry is that I may treat another person the same way. Like I may reduce them to their work output or something like that, in an attempt to keep up with the time, so to speak, or an attempt to so I was hoping that we can jump into this discussion of just like a human centered first perspective on dealing with these tools, just in the beginning of this conversation, because I've said it a million times. For those who don't know, I'm a video producer, video editor, and my whole career has been around this tension of like imbuing my humanity and creativity with technical tools to create content and to make a whole business out of that. And that business model is changing all across the board, whether it's indie solo filmmakers like me, or even on the Hollywood studio level, like on a big blockbuster production. And I'm sure, like, I'm definitely not in the only industry that's being affected by that. So I wanted to open up the discussion. Joe, maybe you can kind of get us going here. If you could just respond to this like reflective period that I was in, because I did take some time to
Yeah.
slow down after your kind of challenge last week.
Awesome.
And I'm just wondering, like, at this point in time, with everything that we're kind of carrying, all the tensions that we're holding, whether what's shared here or even to the listener who's dealing with their own anxieties, how do we productively move forward, like for the sake of ourselves and for humanity, without getting so dramatic? But yeah, how do we move forward based on our discussions?
It's a great question, Lewis. Look, I think there are several ways in which we can move forward. And saying what I've said before, I think it does indeed bear repeating, but I'll try to nuance it differently, and maybe we can, push the envelope here and see where we can go with that. I love the way you sort of couched your own vocational identity with regards to what you do as a videographer, as an artist, in the marriage between the techne and you, right, as the creative agent. What's so novel about the AI is that you can now outsource creativity, right, in a radical way, such that kind of now you now have the option to sort of sit back and watch this thing evolve. And so I think part of the anxiety that comes up for you as an artist, that comes up for me as an academic that engages in the crafting of words and writing and research, is this question of, well, who am I in relation to this? If I take a step back and press play, and it produces something that I could do myself and maybe even do it better, can I is there an element of myself in that product, even though I just watched the automation unfold over time?
Mhm.
And so there are a cluster of questions, I think, that orbit that, and that generates some sense of anxiety, because part of the question that arises is the question of identity and self. So I think one of the ways forward is, once again, repeating, is grounding our perspective in a more robust and capacious anthropology. What does it mean to be a human being? And I think in answering that question, in an attempt to answer that, we need to keep at the forefront this, how can I put it? Not merely a sense of self, but the first and foremost, the idea that we are a human being and not a human doing, right? And
Mhm.
so this generative tool, these AIs, in a certain and in an ironic sense, offer a kind of prophetic critique to us, insofar as we tend to see ourselves or identify ourselves and others by means of productivity,
Mm.
right? By means of productivity. It's like, well, if that's how I see myself and others, and I get my sense of self by means of my productivity, oh my goodness, what's going to happen insofar as this technology can sort of usurp my sense of self and do it in a far more sexier and sophisticated way? And so then that sort of throws us back on our heels, and it requires us to say, is it the case that I'm merely what I do? Or have I misplaced my identity, and maybe my sense of self and my understanding of what it means to be human is something grounded more in the ontological, more in being as such? And of course, right, that opens up some spaces for further questions. So I think, and I don't know if I'm clear here, right, but I think in sort of navigating these cluster of questions and following the trail, part of what that means is being honest with ourselves and sitting with the anxiety and saying, where is that coming from? It will lead us into deeper spaces where we can find I think, a more humane insight, and maybe even recover an authentic vision of what it means to be human.
In regards to just, I don't know, I guess the pushback I had, what you're offering, it touched upon my anxiety in that, like, I felt like it was like from a place of privilege to even be able to take time to sit back and to process, like, what does it mean to be human?
Mm.
And like
Yeah.
the monkey part of my brain is like, how am I going to make money? Like, how am I going to solve all these economic challenges and stuff? And I guess that's the one follow-up question, as like as guilty as it is to admit, is like, how can I arrive at like what I should be doing now in this economy, starting from this big picture place of what does it mean to be human? I guess, like,
Let me
it's almost like, go ahead.
I want to, yeah, I mean, just real quick, that's such an excellent question. I just want to jump on that real
Go
quick.
ahead.
Messaging is important. And I don't mean this in the sense of advertisement per se, but in the sense of self, maybe even preservation. So, within the sphere of the economic, things like words like human made, human owned, human produced, there was a soul in the making of this. Right. Right. So even sitting with a 8.5 by 11 scrap piece of paper, writing out certain words like, do I vibe with that? Is that true? Can I run with that? If so, what would that look like practically? And if I do run with something like this, can I use that as a marketing tool? As an artist, let's say, will people bite? Do people really want the human product, the human soul, even though it may be somewhat flawed or imperfect compared to what the technology can afford us now? Right. So I think some of those dynamics could be played out as a response. I just wanted, because I didn't want to lose that train of thought, but I think that might
Yeah.
be, an interesting way forward.
Edwin, I was wondering if you could speak to the economics of it too. Like, I just think the tension that I'm sensing in this moment is like taking the time to slow down, to reevaluate my perspective on life. I've felt very convicted by the whole human doing and human being aspect. I feel like I I prioritize human doing and judge others by the same, especially in the day to day. And I wonder, like, how could we even begin to wrestle with something like that on an existential level while also carrying the burden of providing financially, whether it's for ourselves, our loved ones, and just the practicalness of existing in a capitalist economy.
Yeah, this is something I'm spending a lot of time thinking about. But let me start with this point of privilege, right? So we are in a conversation amongst the three of us as sort of like quote unquote knowledge workers. There's an entire group of people. I used to work in the manufacturing space who have already seen this, right? And I've seen folks who used to work on the blades of engines who their entire identity was about that. Their fathers did that work and they carried it on. And then it just as quickly in the beginning of this century, they were replaced with machines and less of them were needed. So I just want to say that even in our conversation, there is a point of privilege in that this is starting to impact us in a way that has impacted others. And one thing that AI is doing, which I think we just never saw coming, is there's a commoditization of knowledge. And information right now is now something that machines can produce. It makes it very challenging for anyone in the economy that is in that space. So I'll start there, and then I'll add that I'm really going to wrap this in some practicality around what Joe has said, which is that I'm wrestling as an individual with the fact that as a father, I need to produce for my family. The anxiety that arises from that comes from a space of psychological predisposition for me to play that role. So sitting back means taking what Joe said. It means it's something so much bigger than those words. The act of doing that really means challenging yourself in the things that you do, because the anxiety that you bring into that is the very thing, is the root that you're actually speaking to, right? So the source of your anxiety is a source of existential angst that is associated with your identity. Lots of words there, only to say that the minute you redefine that is the minute you actually start to challenge those anxiety. So we've spoken about this. The challenge with capitalism is that it pushes on a role on us that we must produce. And so going to school, getting a degree at a university, all of these things are predicated on the fact that we will actually go into the workplace and do a certain job to make money and buy these things that are indicators of the fact that we've won that game. We are smart enough to make enough money to buy that car, to live in that place, and so on. It's like, in some ways, it's like the Matrix. If you wanted to, if you are the type of person that needs to live in the delusion that that's our reality, there's not much I can say that's going to help. But if you want, I forgot if it was the red or blue pill, but if you want to take that pill and you want to start to dismantle the way you think about that, that's the shield that will protect you from what's to come. Because look, the reality is, in the economic times that we're living in right now, there's nothing I'm going to say that's going to actually make you more productive, right? There's a lot of investment advice I can give about like savings rate, right? And FU money, as they like to say in financial services. So like on and I could say all that. But given the trajectory of our economy and this technology, there's the reality that that's not going to happen fast enough for you to do, which means that you're going to find yourself in a world, and I can speak to myself, right? I'm going to find myself in a world as a father and a husband that has to, quote unquote, take care of this household without a job. I don't control my destiny from that perspective. If I lose my job tomorrow, economically, I'm fragile. Psychologically, I'm resilient. If I take the approaches that Joe has really pushed on us to reflect on. And so that's why it's so important. It's almost no longer a choice. If you really understand it, it's no longer a choice for you to do the reflection that Joe has talked to us about. it's almost a necessity. And unfortunately, we wait for disaster to occur before we start to say, "Oh, okay, I do need to start thinking about my be
Right.
right." And by that time, it's almost too late, right? You catch yourself in despair. But if you start the practice today, it makes you that much more resilient. So yeah, I can stop there, but it's
Well, and the practice doesn't have to be in this isolated solipsistic bubble. My late father used to say, put the technology to work. Yeah, put the technology to work. He was making these comments, of course, before the advent of AI.
Hmm.
And so what that would look like practically, let's say for you, Lewis, or for anyone, is prompting AI to generate a response to a question like, how can I future proof my career, my job, my vocation? Help me to reimagine how I can continue to do the work that I do in light of the automated services that are coming by means of AI. And guess what? It's going to give you some really interesting feedback. So you're now actually using the technology to help you think through ways in which you can future proof or AI proof or AI resilience or whatever language you want to use
Mhm.
that particular job. And I'm not saying that that's the only way in which we ought to move forward, but hey, it's a tool. So we have to begin to play 3D chess. We don't want to think us versus this or it. How can we use that, bring that into the dynamic unfolding of our thinking critically concerning this particular issue that is cause for concern?
Joe. Can I add one more thing to what you said there?
Yeah.
This has been from a usage perspective really helpful for me. There's this concept in business and military called wargaming, where you actually go through a simulation of worst case scenarios and how you would react to that. I find that to be actually pretty helpful. And what you're saying, Joe, is an aspect of that. That's what reminded me. And it sucks, but to ask yourself the question or go through the exercise of what would happen if if I was not able to make money on whatever job, or I lost my job tomorrow, what would happen? In this wargaming exercise, it's really, really helpful to bring in the folks in your in your proximity, the relationships you have, because a lot of this anxiety comes from our relationship. Like if we were by ourselves, right, we're like, all right, I'll caveman this out, right?
Right.
I'll go hunt something, or like I figure it out, right? But the anxieties really come from the relationships we have, the people we're trying to protect, right? And if you bring them into this exercise of wargaming, all right, what would happen in this scenario? Sort of the generative exercises that Joe is referring to becomes really helpful and start to be clearer in those situations, right? It's like, what would I have to do, right? Do I Uber? Like, what's my identity like if I Uber? And you start to ask those questions. So I'm really a proponent of scenario planning in wargaming.
I what I'm hearing from what you guys shared is kind of like this concept of building like agility and resilience, like as a person, and I feel like it is a much needed skill, especially considering just like even recently the volatility of like the stock market and economies and global politics. Like I know that it seems like a far off thing, but it feels like those types of tectonic shifts, like you said, Edwin, like it's going to eventually have a ripple effect on us as individuals. And I wonder if you can each kind of speak into that, like in the midst of even like, I wouldn't even just put it to AI or generative AI. Like there's so much more going on that's contributing to the volatility of the economy. How, like, is there a way to stay resilient or to develop a resilience in the face of what I feel like is a oncoming calamity, if you will, like without being so cynical, but just it's not like we're in a completely quiet, peaceful, minimalistic kind of era of living. Like there's always so much going on. It's easy to get distracted on even like what's outside of ourselves, and I'm just trying to find the strength and encouragement to stay on task of what you guys are sharing, which is to develop this type of resilience and a paradigm shift of how we see ourselves. And it already seems tough to do like in a vacuum, but just like within the real world and with current events kind of like peering in all the time. How do we stay strong, and how do we navigate that in the time that we're in right now?
Yeah. Maybe I can build on sort of this wargaming scenario planning I was
Mm-hmm.
referring to. And let's make this like really tactical. Building on what Joe was talking about with the adoption of the technology itself, right? The very thing that is part of the disruption that is coming. I do think there's a lot of value add associated with understanding how to work with these generative models. And what that does mean is that there's going to be less of a, I think, of a role for someone to come out of university fully prepared to engage the workforce, and someone hires them to do that one thing. In this world, I think you actually have to be a lot more creative. Creativity actually is paramount. And part of the resiliency is being able to do multiple things, use your skill set. Because let's talk about the positive of AI right now. The positive of AI is that someone who's not able to create a YouTube video, or able to create an image for the book that they're writing can now do that themselves. Right. So what does that mean in terms of how they scale the work that they're doing, the way they engage the world? Joe said this last week in terms of this sort of human relationship is probably going to become a lot more important. And how do you leverage the tools that are at our disposal now to do more of that is going to be key. So just from a practical perspective, in terms of the value that we have to each other, which capital is attached to that, I think that's going to be really, really important moving forward. The other aspect of that is I really do think that regardless of what the economy does, there's going to be enough of a disruption to our geopolitics that understanding not only our role in this world so we're in the United States, right? For anybody who's listening internationally, understanding the world is going to be pretty important. And part of the flexibility, and this is true of any recession or any economic upheaval, even though we're talking about like protectionist policies and we're talking about like every country going inward, it's going to be more important in the world that's coming for us to be more global in the way that we interact. So there is this global village that we are forgetting about because of our fears and our anxieties that actually opens up, right? So a creator, Lewis, you were talking about the work that you were doing. If you think about it, I'm pretty sure a lot of the work that you were doing was limited to clients in your, either local or national, even maybe national level.
Mm.
If you start to think about like, wait, how can I expand that to a more international, the opportunity exists, right? And the technology exists for you to do such things. So I think we just got to think a little bit bigger as individuals, and the webs that we create with others starts to expand and benefit us in ways that we previously weren't able to imagine.
Joe, could you close this discussion out with like offering a question or word of wisdom to help us kind of engage in that paradigm shift that Edwin's talking about? Like, how can we kind of break the mental model that we currently have, whether we realize it or not? Like, how can we prepare ourselves to look at this ever-changing world like in a different way to prepare us for what's to come?
I think the way forward is something that is deeply earthy, deeply practical, and intentionally slow. So again, to use the example that I brought up before, sitting with a blank piece of paper, pencil, pen, and start with something like, who am I and who am I not? Which is a nice exercise that comes from New Life Fellowship, the church that I used to work at. It's a great exercise to explore your vocational identity and your identity as such, even before vocation, right? Who am I and who am I not? Sitting with that, right? Then another exercise, something along the lines of identifying 3 to 5 anxieties that are coming up. Identifying here means articulating it in a sentence per anxiety, which concretizes, which names, and thus gives greater clarity to oneself. What is it that is coming up for me, right? So identifying the anxiety. I am anxious about the possibility of losing my job because of AI, right? Or something along those lines. Doing that work, again, taking a step back, sitting with that, right? Sitting, when I say sitting with that, meaning just reread those sentences, sort of just be there with that content. Don't run away. Don't turn to the phone. Don't, right? Just stay there. In that mode and in that spirit in which I say stay there, I think we can learn a lot from simply, and great minds like Blaise Pascal have said this, Soren Kierkegaard, closing the door of any distraction for an extended period of time and taking a kind of retreat so that we can go a bit deeper in introspection around some of these things that we're doing ahead of time, like who am I not, who am I, what are my anxieties, things like that. So let me just pause there for a second and say, notice that the kind of work that I'm inviting folks to engage in, again, to repeat, is slow, it's intentional. It might appear to be obtuse or weird because within a certain executive mindset, let's say for a subset of folks, is like, okay, give me something that I can do now, right? Practically. And those sort of deeper exercises may seem a bit weird, right? But I'm going to say they're very important. And it's foundational so that we can launch out and go forward. I've said this in previous conversations back. I think, at least for me personally, spiritual practices are non-negotiable. They're really key. What that may look like for the person, I leave that up for the person, but engaging in certain activities that allow one to, let's say, in a sort of existential sense, pivot and then think about the frame in which we find ourselves in light of the transcendent. And so questions like, okay, what really matters? What is, in fact, the good life, the ideal life? What am I after? What is it? What are my values? What are my hopes and my wishes in light of those spiritual practices, right? These activities, I think, are really non-negotiable. They're really essential for the deeper work to come out. And I would encourage folks to give those things a try. Okay. And watch what happens. There's a magic that happens. There are things that will arise, that will shine, that will throw light on the situation from a different angle. And that could be very liberating.
Well, I'm excited to make the time and to go through the hard work of doing that. And I encourage anyone who's listening to do the same. I hope that in future conversations we can actually have like a follow-up or something in regards to that practice, because I do think that we're going to need to push ourselves forward in that kind of way in order to kind of make sense of the many things kind of going on. But with that, Joe and Edwin, I want to thank you guys so much for just taking the time to kind of like share your perspective on these things. I know that I feel like every week it's like me talking about like my work and how like AI is taking my job almost, but it really does, like, even just listening to you guys, it's given me hope, but it also is allowing me to kind of identify my anxieties in a way where it feels like it's manageable, that the work that needs to follow that is more tangible than before. So I just want to give you guys like an extra shout out this week because I really do appreciate these conversations, and I'm sure the listener does as well. So thank you guys very much.
You're welcome, Lewis. Thank you.
Thanks, Lewis. That was great.